I should tell you a little bit about Dr. Tuttle. I believe you know a certain amount about Khenpo Sodargye, but Gray Tuttle is the Leela Hadley Luce Associate Professor of Modern Tibetan Studies in the Department of Asian Language and Culture at Columbia University. And he was here recently to celebrate the publication of a book he edited called The Tibetan History Reader. And that book, amongst many others, is available at our shop upstairs as well. And we're delighted that he's returning to have a conversation with Khenpo about why Tibetan Buddhism has found so much popularity amongst Chinese in mainland China. And so this is an intellectual exchange between two great thinkers about an interesting cultural exchange that is happening, and we are lucky enough this afternoon to be witnesses to it. So if you'll join me, please, in welcoming Professor Gray Tuttle and Khenpo Sodargye. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce our guest of great honor today, Khenpo Sodargye, a native of Draco in Kham, a leading Buddhist teacher and affiliated for a long time since the founding with Larung Academy in northern Sichuan province. He is one of the original disciples of Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, obviously one of the leading lamas of the 20th century. And his task has been to spread Tibetan Buddhism in general and the Nyingma teachings in particular. And he's especially interested in a Tibetan code of happiness, which he sees really as a science of finding happiness. And I think many of you here today know something of that. If you don't, we'll hear something about it today. And I'm guessing from the number of people who do speak Chinese, this first question may be well known as well, but I still think it's worth asking Khenpo to reflect a little bit for those of you who aren't familiar or who haven't had the long kind of experience that he's had with the popularity of Tibetan Buddhism in China, to please tell us a little bit the background about the popularity of Tibetan Buddhism among Chinese.
Prof. Tenhua Rui from Columbia University, as well as the esteemed Mr. Tim, who is from the Ruby Museum. And each and every one of you together, we have this special opportunity. As a monk from the remote, snowy, ancient Tibetan plateau, speaking as a monastic, I believe that the exchange of ideas, in other words, mutual discussion, is very necessary. So to everyone who helped create these conditions, I want to thank you all first. Just now, the respected Professor Tenhua Rui asked the first question. Right now, at this moment, there are so many people in China who are going to Tibet to study. I have also thought about this question for a long time. Perhaps there are actually two different aspects to this. First, because Tibetan Buddhism has a unique tradition, currently has a complete traditional system. This kind of traditional system, as we know it, I once read some time ago in Master Fazun's autobiography that when Master Fazun first started out, his main purpose in going to Tibet was also to keep on learning and growing like Yijing, that they had not translated many of the central doctrines of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as his deep and intense interest in Vajrayana Buddhism. He wanted to do some translation work to fill gaps that Chinese Buddhism lacked. Moreover, within Tibetan Buddhism as a tradition, there are many aspects of including history, geography, the science of arts and crafts, as well as politics, medicine, and so on. There is much such material. This was ultimately Master Fazun's purpose for studying there. Then there was Master Nengai. His purpose was a bit different. His main reason for going to Tibet to study was to focus mainly on studying esoteric teachings. After he began studying Buddhism, he saw at the Yonghe Palace many catalogs of Buddhist scriptures. In the end, he felt that some of the various methods in the exoteric tradition might still be somewhat imperfect. So he went to Tibet. He saw in Tibetan Buddhism catalogs of even deeper and more advanced scriptures. Later, preparing to enter Tibet in Chongqing, it happened that Master Daiyong returned from studying in Japan. This was a fortunate connection. Master Daiyong also said for esoteric study, Tibet is even more exceptional than Japan. Through luck, he arrived in Tibet. Master Nengai, speaking of modern times, was truly an extraordinary figure, a Han Chinese who went to the history of these two individuals. In fact, Professor滕华睿has a book called Constructing Modern China's Tibetan Buddhists. I read it before, quite some time ago when I was living in Hong Kong. I remember it well. I also just asked him to sign his name for me. I think that for all of us, since he also referenced this, I had also read the biography of Master Nengai before. Master Fazun's autobiography. Nowadays, many people in the West often say going to Tibet helped nihilism or utopianism. I think that might actually be the case for some people, at least that's what it seems like to me. But for most people, I believe some study Vajrayana Buddhism, while others study different subjects like astronomy, geography, and so on. Some people genuinely and strongly feel that Tibet has a very complete and unblemished form of Buddhism in the Tibetan region, which is still preserved even today. So I believe they are not pursuing something vague and insubstantial. Everyone has different goals and different goals. Especially in our society today, more than ever, traditional cultures of many nations have become marginalized and turned into mere academic subjects. At such a time, Tibetan Buddhism happens to be a particularly ancient and highly valuable science of the mind. This science of the mind actually happens to fill the gap in our spiritual needs. In other words, people today especially need nourishment for the soul. If we rely solely on material conditions to satisfy ourselves, it becomes very difficult. That is basically roughly my first point of view.
I also wanted to think about the role specifically of someone like Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok in reaching out to and sort of touching an audience among the Chinese. I had the good fortune to hear him teach when he was here in New York City in 1993 and have followed the growth of your institution, Larung since then. Can you talk about basically the foundations of the monastery, of the teachings that are particular to it, the organizations that grow out of that institution, and the outlook in general, such as your idea of the Tibetan Code of Happiness, and what has either continued since his time and what might have changed in the last decade since his passing away?
20 years ago, back in time, it should have been around the year 1993, I accompanied my guru, Jigme Phuntsok, to New York in the United States. At that time, we visited different Dharma centers and also taught some Dharma. Just the day before yesterday, when I was in Boston, there were many professors, all of whom had met His Holiness, the Dharma King. There are also many professors at Columbia had also met His Holiness the Dharma King. At that time, I was very young, carrying a backpack every day, following behind the Dharma King. So I wasn't particularly clear about everything. But now, actually hearing directly from them for the first time, many people truly have faith in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, value Tibetan Buddhism unsouthern. 20 years ago, They were already conducting research in this field, taking it very seriously and showing great interest. And 20 years later, they are still researching in the same way. So speaking for myself, I feel that their academic spirit is truly and genuinely commendable. Another point is that 20 years ago, when we first came to New York, we established the renowned Larung Exoteric and Esoteric Center located in the vibrant city of New York City. Later on, at different times in various places, including now, there are currently many various exoteric and esoteric centers in the United States. The welcoming, serene, and peaceful Bodhi Society Center, it continues to this day. I think even today, there are many intellectuals coming from various and distinct centers. As for our Larung, in particular, when the Dharma King, the wish-fulfilling jewel, came, I remember there was a report in the World Journal in New York. At that time, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok is abbot of the largest Buddhist institute in the world. At that time, the World Journal said Larung Buddhist Institute had over 2,000 people. At that time, we thought that was a lot. But compared to now, it might be even more right now. So the number of monastics and people who are actively engaged in studying and practicing Buddhism is continuously increasing nowadays. Especially now, at this particular moment in China, many people simply do not have any faith. Right now, it just happens people feel that not only do we need reform and openness in material terms, but more importantly, we need inner openness, a sense of inner fulfillment and contentment. This is very important. When I moved to America, the economic situation in America was very good at that time. But in the end, people feel that economically and materially, to truly find eternal happiness is extremely difficult. Later, many people kept constantly searching for spiritual happiness. Therefore, whether I was in Tibetan or in different countries, I tell them all, if you really want to understand happiness, perhaps it is within different religions. Through spiritual education, one must transform internally. No matter what kind of situation you are in your life, you will be happy. If you do not have spiritual education, well, maybe you will be truly happy for a little while. For example, some people, when you buy a house, you're happy, or when you buy a car, you feel happy, or when your family members start a family and establish their careers, one may feel happiness. But after some time, this again turns into another fundamental cause of suffering. So I think our spiritual education should go deeper. The gain of spiritual wisdom is especially important for us today, truly. 20 years later, the present Larung Buddhist Academy, although the Dharma King has passed away, the Dharma King left behind for future generations many highly qualified eminent monks and great masters at our academy. They not only truly possess wisdom, but also altruistic hearts and a strong desire to help others, as well as powerful abilities. Within this kind of community that gathers talented people, I believe that the Dharma should continue to flourish.
Following up on that question, I'm curious about the idea of, people's lives needing more meaning, right, than just material wealth. And there's just been discussion that, the reason that Tibetan Buddhism is so popular today in China is due to some kind of crisis, a crisis of lack of belief, a lack of faith and things. And yet we know from what Khenpo said earlier that, in the 1920s and 30s, there was also a strong interest in Tibetan Buddhism, not just among monks like Fadzun and Nanghai, but also among lay people, all over China. I mean, every big city in the 1930s in China had some kind of Dharma center. It welcomed lamas and so forth. There was a lot of interest at that time in kind of tantric rituals, initiations, and so forth. But there were also serious students of the academic side of Tibetan Buddhism. A place like the Hanzang Jiali Xueyuan, in Chongqing, a Sino-Tibetan Buddhist institute set up in Chongqing. So I'm curious nowadays what the kind of balance is of interest. Is it also a kind of equal balance between people who want initiations and people who want to do exoteric Xianzong studies? And especially, I mean, in the 30s, I think there were very few Chinese monks. There were exceptions that Chinese monks wanted to study Tibetan Buddhism. Fa Zun and Nanghai are the most famous exceptions. But I'm wondering, nowadays, are there many more Chinese Buddhist monks and nuns who are studying? And why do you think that difference is?
Historically, well, especially during the Yuan and Ming dynasties, which were particularly notable periods, because at that time they had connections with the emperor, the primary ruler, is closely related. That's why there are so many people studying Tibetan Buddhism in modern times, especially in history, founded by Master Taishu and Master Fa Zun, the Chongqing Sino-Tibetan Buddhist Institute. This also, for a period of time, played a key role in this. But now, in order to truly continue this truly remarkable legacy, there were also some difficulties that came up during that time. It should be said that by the end of the 20th century, Tibetan Buddhism, traditionally in Tibetan and Han areas, could be said to be very widespread. Among those who study it, some rely on their own personal faith. They wish to be reborn in the Pure Land. Some elders, as well as a group whose education level is not high. In addition, there is a segment made up of intellectuals. In my own view, I have been teaching Buddhism in Chinese for more than 20 years now. During this process, I have found that more and more intellectuals in society interested in Tibetan Buddhism. 10 years ago, I conducted a survey where I interviewed 125 intellectuals, compiled a book called Waves in the Ocean of Wisdom. I saw their educational background, college grads. There are many intellectuals who particularly love Tibetan Buddhism. As we just discussed, there are several reasons. Another reason is that when they seek out a spiritual teacher, the teachers are quite well versed in Buddhist teachings. It's not just about really telling people prostrate and recite scriptures, not that. They should be able doctrinally to convince them from a macro and micro perspective, including modern concepts. In Buddhism, they can find them. This is truly one of their aspirations. Another aspiration is the lineage in Tibet. Since ancient times, from the Buddha to the present, this lineage is very complete because without a lineage, no matter what scriptures we discuss in Tibet, they would not require us to teach them. But up until now, this lineage has continued. Perhaps outside of Tibet, in other places, such a tradition of lineage basically does not exist. So I think, honestly, up to now, among the intellectuals in Tibet, those who seek knowledge, including those individuals who are currently studying Tibetan Buddhism at the renowned Larung monastery, the majority of intellectuals, like those who have earned PhDs in America, or those who earn PhDs elsewhere, they're there. Some become monastics, while others do not wish to become monastics, but continue to stay on as lay members. So what is it that actually attracts them? After all, the main characteristics, strong theory. And another is the more unique tantric practices, which also attract many people from all around. Of course, there are other reasons. Some people are fond of Tibet's blue skies and white clouds. Some enjoy painting. Some like sightseeing and love photography. There is a group.
So the next question I wanted to take in a different direction and talk about an encounter I had on a train in China some years ago, probably 15 years ago. I met a Chinese follower of a Tibetan Lama in Qinghai province, and he was really happy to be studying Tibetan Buddhism. But the main reason he seemed happy was that he thought he'd found in this tradition a sort of permission to be a Buddhist and yet eat meat at the same time. And he thought that's what really set Tibetan Buddhism apart from Chinese Buddhism. And he was an average guy, worked as a bank teller in some city south of Beijing, but he said that his teacher had taught him a mantra that would essentially liberate the animal that he was eating. And as a vegetarian now for some 20 years, I wondered, what's the role of this issue, the vegetarianism? How important is this issue of diet, not eating meat? And how is it specifically related to Chinese Buddhists who are interested in Tibetan Buddhism? I myself first met, I would say, Chinese who were practicing Tibetan Buddhism at a place, Wutaishan. Probably many of you are familiar with this mountain. There were Han Chinese living in temples there, but practicing Tibetan Buddhism and being vegetarian. So that was my first encounter with Tibetan Buddhists who are vegetarian. Of course, there's a history of this, Shapgar and other such figures in Tibetan history, but for the most part, it's exceptional, except Larung seems, to have started somewhat of a movement to head in that direction. Was it an influence from Tibetan's own history, or from encounters with Chinese, or some kind of meeting in the middle of those two ideas?
The last part of the question.
So the last part, I'm thinking, Tibetan Buddhism has a tradition with figures like Shapgar, the famous Lama from Amdo, who was vegetarian, and many others, of course. But for the most part, it's an exception in Tibetan Buddhism to be vegetarian. So is there an influence from China, sort of deliberate influence?
This is actually a very, very good question, truly an excellent one. In the future, when I talk with many Han, I will use this statement to describe them in detail. For clarity, this question, as just mentioned a moment ago, by this individual participant, may indeed be influenced by different lamas. And it's like this, the majority of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and monastics mainly follow a vegetarian diet, generally, though there are some individuals who might nevertheless still, in certain situations, eat meat. But personally, speaking for myself, I would say that from my own perspective, for over 10 years now, I have emphasized vegetarianism. The reason for being vegetarian, actually, I personally study the traditions of Chinese Buddhism, and I feel that this is very much in line with Mahayana Buddhism. Later, within Tibetan Buddhism, when we examine the teachings of Mahayana masters, please analyze again while analyzing actually, as we might be aware, because in the past, in Tibet, in all respects, vegetables transport not convenient, transport, etc. These might also have been reasons. Another reason is that in Theravada Buddhism, it is quite common in many places to eat what is known as the 3 kinds of pure meat. But the most profound intention within the Mahayana Buddhist tradition is that when the Buddha was, he said, the allowances made for the Hinayana were actually temporary and not ultimate. What is most ultimate, according to the Buddha's teachings, is not to consume the flesh of sentient beings. If generally the perspective of Chinese Buddhism were unreasonable, if we thought it was unreasonable, we would not accept it. But it is actually considered to be quite reasonable within the tradition of Mahayana Buddhism. At the same time, if we Buddhists, so many of us reduce our meat consumption, then for the lives of many sentient beings, it is directly related. If we have more than 100 people, all of them eating meat, in this situation, maybe for just one meal, even one pig or one yak might not be enough. But if over 100 of us eat vegetarian, the amount of killing is reduced. So later on, at our Buddhist Institute, always stressed, including to Han Chinese monks, better not eat meat. When I used to teach at the Buddhist Institute, if you attended class, couldn't eat meat. If you ate meat, I wouldn't transmit the Dharma to you. At first, I used this approach, but now, basically, at this point, people who are closely associated with our monastery are all vegetarian. I think in the future, true Mahayana Buddhists. Maybe in this regard, to be more specific, perhaps Wekad is very much in line with the Buddhist scriptures. Moreover, it directly involves the lives of sentient beings. If it is really helpful to life, we feel it is really very meaningful.
I wanted to think about the role in the future for Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, for lay people. I know that when Fadzun was involved at the Hanzang Shui, in the Sino-Tibetan Buddhist Academy in Chongqing, that lay people were also teachers, people who had PhDs and this kind of thing. And I know in the Nyingma tradition also, especially at a place like Mindroling, that there were lay teachers, married lamas who would, who were critical for the lineage, Cherak Lingpa and so forth. So I'm wondering how important in the future is the role of monastic vows, other ethical rules like not eating meat and so forth for the leadership of the Tibetan Buddhist community, or could there be people who are nakpas or laymen, laywomen who will take a role in leading in the future?
In fact, as recorded, the Buddha said in the sutras, whether one is a practitioner or a dharma spreader, whether a monastic. Another point is about lay practitioners in Buddhist scriptures, including in the Kalachakra Tantra, in Vajrayana, it is stated in the same way. Therefore, in Tibetan Buddhism, among some great accomplished masters, there are also some, and among those who spread the Dharma, some do so as lay practitioners. Looking back through history, there have been truly remarkable lay practitioners, as well as the monastics within the community as a whole. It is important to note that maybe in the family are very numerous, while community of monastics is becoming smaller, especially now with the material world outside, colorful and varied, dazzling and bewildering. Monastics keep precepts and stay in the monastery are not very many. In such an era, no matter what, as an ordinary layperson, even if you're unsure, if one wishes to spread the Dharma, to teach the Dharma, the Buddhist scriptures, the requirements for them are quite strict, because as lay people, he may be somewhat dissatisfied with his family or work and may have more unique personal interests. If it's about studying the Dharma, anyone can learn them and should be able to. The Buddha also said that his teachings simply open to all, anyone can learn them. But if we are to teach the Dharma to others, first, our own conduct must meet the standards of virtue. Second, one must have systematic Buddhist education. Without systematic education, it is not permitted to teach the Dharma. Similar to being a university professor, they need certain qualifications before they can simply accept their own disciples or students, just like that. Recently, we have been advocating in Tibetan or Han regions, or among other ethnic groups and countries. All of them are, in fact, monks who come to preach. It is not practical nowadays. We need quite a few intellectuals, lay people, those who are responsible for religion and for people, to teach what is appropriate to others. Same here, if they have basic grasp of, teach these Dharma teachings to others. Recently, I have been advocating that they should serve as counselors, guiding everyone, and then very gradually engage in advanced Dharma exchanges. As we are a group at home, it's huge. Therefore, those who are wise should share knowledge, this valuable energy and wisdom with one another. For a group of people, for society as a whole, this is quite indispensable. We have always advocated as well that as lay people, as long as it is within proper situations, we should share the truth with one another. Everyone should take responsibility for this. Let me just take a moment to ask Professor Tenghua a question, because I have noticed that as a professional historian, his contribution to Tibetan Buddhism attached great importance to Tibetan culture. I was at Columbia yesterday. Many professors also attach great importance to Tibetan culture. My first question is, at Columbia University, research on Tibetan culture and Tibetan Buddhism, what is the situation like at the university? And my second question is, over all these years, why have you placed importance on and focused on Tibetan culture?
So, to get to the question about Columbia, I mean, I think it's very different, not just from Chinese institutions that do research, but also from a German or a European model where there can be a sort of research project in Europe or China. In America, it's much more, I guess, fitting with our approach. We all pursue our own interests. And so, of course, the main thing that's different about Columbia is the interest in modern Tibet. And that is something that is I think, widespread across the university. I think we have 8 people at Columbia teaching something about Tibetan culture right now. And those on the religion side, Bob Thurman and his students, tend to study Tibetan Buddhism across time. A lot of interest in translating, for instance, translating the complete Tibetan canon into English, which is a monumental task and one that I really admire them pursuing. But I guess on the modern side, we are really interested in the last 300-400 years in Tibetan history and the kind of changes, developments that have taken place in that time. So I think that's something that's really unique about Columbia University. So for my own interest, I think it's probably very similar to the kind of students that you've had come from China, kind of an intellectual interest in the beginning, a personal interest. I had the good fortune to grow up at a time when there was a lot of exchange, a lot of debates about the situation in Tibet. I'd studied Chinese first. I think that's maybe unusual. A lot of the scholars in America have gone to Tibet first or gone into exile and met Tibetan lamas in Nepal or in India. My own experience was studying Chinese and then learning about Tibetan Buddhism. And I thought that the debate that was being sort of waged in the media and in the kind of campaign that was going on in America was a little clearly one-sided. And as I traveled to China and made my way to Tibet, I realized there was a different narrative there. And so quite aside from my personal interest, I became interested in the history of relationships. It seemed so negative, sort of China versus Tibet at that time. And as I explored the history in the early 20th century, I realized that Chinese and Tibetans were able to work together and there could be sort of positive outcomes. And so I wanted to tell that narrative and bring that light to that past history of successful encounters. And I think since that time now I'm moving back, looking at the Qing dynasty and seeing that connection go even farther back in time. And I guess I look to the past with hope to the future. Okay, now I'd like to invite Tim McHenry, who has been our gracious host here at the Rubin Museum of Art. Thank you for that, and you have a few words for us.
Well, yes, there are many thanks due to putting this program together, and not least, of course, Professor Gray Tuttle, who expertly guided us through these many questions that we've all been burning to ask ourselves, but he put them much more eloquently than we could. And lastly, but of course foremost, we want to thank Khenpo. As I say, this is a place of scholarship, and we would like to honor your scholarship, Khenpo, with some catalogs from the museum that were created specially for the exhibitions that we've mounted, and I hope you'll accept them on the behalf of the Buddhists. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you.
이 단체 도가냐 돈이 되잖아 다시 길가나 지라노 출발 주변 손은 좋아져
만드는 거를 만나서들도 만드는 거를 만나서도 만드는 거를 만나서들도